Welcome, dear friend, to this evening's tale, a story crafted especially for those quiet hours when the world has grown still and sleep beckons from just beyond the veil of consciousness. Tonight, we journey together into a mystery most peculiar, one that finds the great detective Sherlock Holmes confronted not with the usual crimes of London's shadowed streets, but with something far more ancient, far more elusive. This is a story to carry you gently into dreams, to slow the racing thoughts of the day, and to wrap you in the comfort of mystery solved by firelight and reason. I am so glad you are here, wherever you might be listening from. Whatever corner of this world has brought you to this moment of rest. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling upon London for 3 days without cessation, a soft and persistent whisper against the windows of 221B Baker Street, and within those familiar rooms, the fire in the hearth crackled with a voice all its own, speaking in the ancient language of burning wood and glowing embers. I sat in my customary chair, watching my friend Sherlock Holmes as he stood before the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the gray afternoon light that struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds beyond. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen eyes fixed upon something in the street below that I could not discern. The rooms were warm, almost drowsy with heat from the fire, and the scent of Mrs. Hudson's afternoon tea mingled with the familiar aroma of Holmes's tobacco, creating an atmosphere of such profound comfort that I found my own thoughts beginning to drift like autumn leaves upon a quiet pond. Outside, the city moved in muffled tones, the usual cacophony of hooves and wheels and human voices softened by the curtain of rain into something almost musical, a lullaby for a metropolis that never truly slept. I had just reached for my teacup, feeling the warmth of the porcelain against my palm, when Holmes spoke at last, his voice low and contemplative. "Watson," he said without turning from the window, "what do you make of a man who travels halfway across the world to consult me about footprints?" I set down my cup with the gentlest of sounds, the china meeting the saucer with barely a whisper. "Footprints?" I replied, settling deeper into my chair. "That seems rather mundane for your attention, Holmes." He turned then, and I saw the faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth, that expression I had come to recognize as the harbinger of something extraordinary. "Ah, but these are no ordinary footprints, my dear fellow. These are footprints measuring some 18 inches in length, pressed deep into the soil of the American wilderness, belonging to a creature that should not, according to all accepted scientific knowledge, exist." The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and I found myself leaning forward, my fatigue momentarily forgotten. "You speak of the American legends," I said quietly, "the tales of wild men in the forests." Holmes moved from the window, his movements graceful and unhurried, crossing to his chair and settling into it with the ease of a cat finding its favorite spot in a patch of sunlight. "Indeed, the native peoples have stories stretching back centuries. They call it Sasquatch, among other names. The settlers who have pushed into the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest speak of encounters with towering, hair-covered beings that walk upright like men but possess a strength and stature that defies human proportions." He reached for his pipe, his long fingers moving through the ritual of filling and lighting it with practiced precision. "Until this afternoon, I would have dismissed such tales as folklore, the products of isolation and imagination. But our visitor brings evidence that demands consideration." I glanced toward the door as if expecting this mysterious visitor to materialize, but the hallway beyond remained empty and quiet, save for the distant sounds of Mrs. Hudson moving about in the kitchen below. "Who is this person?" I asked, my voice barely above a murmur. Holmes drew upon his pipe, and the sweet smoke curled upward, catching the firelight and creating lazy spirals in the warm air. "His name is Professor Cornelius Blackwood, a naturalist and ethnographer who has spent the past 5 years living among the indigenous peoples of the British Columbia interior. He arrived in London yesterday, traveled directly from Liverpool, and sent word this morning requesting an audience on a matter of utmost urgency and, as he put it, profound scientific importance." The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a clock chimed the hour with soft, melodious tones that seemed to come from very far away. "He should arrive within the quarter hour," Holmes continued, his eyes half closed as he contemplated the smoke rising from his pipe. "In his letter, he mentions not only footprints but also hair samples, recordings made upon Edison's phonograph of vocalizations unlike any known animal, and testimonies from both native guides and European settlers who claim to have observed these creatures at close range." I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with cold, a sensation of standing upon the threshold of something that challenged the very boundaries of the known world. "You believe him?" I asked softly. Holmes opened his eyes fully then, and I saw in them that peculiar light that appeared when a problem worthy of his abilities presented itself. "I believe that something has compelled a respected academic to abandon his research and travel across an ocean to seek my counsel. Whether that something is a genuine zoological discovery or an elaborate hoax remains to be determined. But the mystery itself, Watson, the mystery is already quite real. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from." The fire settled lower in the grate, and I rose to add another log, feeling the pleasant heat against my face as the flames accepted their new fuel and began to climb higher once more. The wood was oak, aged and dry, and it caught quickly, sending up a fresh wave of warmth and light that pushed back the gray dimness of the rainy afternoon. When I returned to my seat, Holmes was gazing into the fire, his expression distant, and I knew that his remarkable mind was already at work, constructing theories and cataloging the information he had received. "The indigenous peoples," he said after a long moment, "possess knowledge of the natural world that far exceeds our own in many respects. They have lived in those forests for thousands of years, Watson, observing, learning, surviving. If they speak of these beings not as spirits or demons, but as flesh and blood creatures that share their territories, I am inclined to give their testimonies considerable weight." The minutes passed in comfortable silence, marked only by the rain and the fire and the slow ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. I found my eyes growing heavy, lulled by the warmth and the soft sounds, and I was just beginning to drift into that pleasant state between waking and sleeping, when there came a knock upon the door below, firm, but not harsh, the knock of someone who understood the value of quietude. Holmes rose smoothly from his chair. "That will be Professor Blackwood," he said, and there was an undercurrent of anticipation in his voice that made me straighten in my chair, shaking off the drowsiness. We heard Mrs. Hudson's voice, muffled and welcoming, and then footsteps upon the stairs, slow and measured, the footsteps of a man who had traveled far and carried the weight of extraordinary knowledge. The door opened, and our visitor entered, like a figure from another world entirely. Professor Cornelius Blackwood was a man of perhaps 50 years, his face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled ancient leather, lined with the marks of long exposure to elements far harsher than London's gentle rain. He was tall, though not so tall as Holmes, and possessed a wiry strength that spoke of years spent in physical pursuit of knowledge rather than in the comfort of university halls. His clothing was practical, well-worn, bearing the traces of forest and mountain, and he carried with him a large leather satchel that looked as though it had traveled through every wilderness on earth. But it was his eyes that captured my attention most completely, pale blue eyes that held within them a mixture of wonder and something approaching fear, the eyes of a man who had seen something that had shaken the very foundations of his understanding of the world. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice was deep and steady, with the faint trace of an accent I could not quite place, perhaps the result of years spent speaking languages other than English. "Dr. Watson, I am grateful beyond measure that you have agreed to see me." Holmes extended his hand, and the two men shook with the firm grip of those who recognized in each other a kindred dedication to truth. "Please, Professor, sit." Holmes gestured toward the chair I had been occupying, and I moved to the smaller seat near the bookshelf, content to observe. "You have traveled a great distance. Allow me to offer you tea." Blackwood settled into the chair with a sigh that spoke of profound weariness, not merely physical, but spiritual, the exhaustion of one who has carried an impossible burden for too long alone. "Tea would be most welcome," he said softly. Holmes moved to the tea service with uncharacteristic attentiveness, pouring with careful precision, adding the milk and sugar without asking, and I realized that he had somehow already deduced our visitor's preferences. He handed the cup to Blackwood, who accepted it with both hands, as if drawing sustenance not merely from the beverage, but from the simple human ritual of hospitality. The professor took a long sip, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation, and when he opened them again, some of the tension seemed to have left his shoulders. "I apologize for arriving unannounced with such an outlandish tale," he began, but Holmes raised a hand gently. "There is no need for apologies, Professor. You come seeking answers to questions that trouble you deeply. That is the very purpose of my work. Please, tell us your story in whatever manner feels most natural. We have all evening, and the night beyond if necessary." Blackwood set his teacup upon the small table beside his chair, and his hands, I noticed, trembled ever so slightly, though whether from fatigue or emotion I could not determine. "I must begin 5 years ago," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a man accustomed to lecturing, to organizing complex information into narrative form. "I received a grant from the Royal Geographical Society to study the indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest, particularly the coastal Salish peoples and the interior Sequoians. My intention was to document their languages, their traditions, their relationship with the land before the inexorable march of European settlement erased such knowledge forever." The fire crackled softly, and outside the rain had intensified slightly, creating a cocoon of sound that made the room feel even more removed from the ordinary world. "During my first year, I lived in a small settlement near what the natives call Stasile, a valley of particular spiritual significance. It was there that I first heard the stories, told around fires much like this one, of the Saskats, the wild men of the forests. The professor's voice had taken on a quality that reminded me of water flowing over smooth stones, steady and unhurried, and I found myself sinking deeper into my chair, allowing the tale to wash over me like a warm tide. Holmes had returned to his own seat, his pipe forgotten in his hand, his entire attention focused upon our guest with that peculiar intensity that transformed him from mere listener into living recorder of every detail, every nuance of expression and tone. The rain outside had settled into a rhythm so constant that it became almost like silence, a backdrop against which the human voice could paint pictures of distant lands and impossible creatures. Blackwood's eyes had grown distant, looking not at the comfortable room around him, but at memories of forests so vast that a man might walk for months without seeing another soul. "The stories were consistent," he continued, reaching absently for his teacup and taking another slow sip before setting it down with infinite care. "Across different villages, different language groups, separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness, the descriptions matched with remarkable precision. Beings that stood between 7 and 9 feet in height, covered in dark hair ranging from black to reddish-brown, with broad shoulders and arms of tremendous length. They were said to be shy, avoiding human contact, living in the deepest forests and highest mountains, emerging only occasionally, usually at dawn or dusk, when the light played tricks with the eyes." He paused, his fingers drumming softly against the arm of the chair, a gesture that spoke of nervous energy barely contained. "At first, I documented these accounts as I would any folklore, fascinating cultural artifacts that revealed the indigenous worldview, their relationship with the unknown. I had no expectation of encountering anything that might validate the legends as something more than myth." Holmes shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking with a sound like a contented sigh. "But something changed your perspective," he said quietly, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact. Blackwood nodded slowly, his weathered face catching the firelight in a way that deepened every line and shadow. "In my second year, I was traveling with a guide named Similano, a man of great knowledge and quiet wisdom, through a region of old-growth forest that had never known the axe. We had been walking since dawn, following game trails and stream beds, documenting plants used in traditional medicine. The day was warm, unusually so for that latitude, and the forest was alive with birdsong and the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth." He fell silent for a moment, and I noticed that his hands had clenched slightly, the knuckles whitening. "We came to a clearing beside a creek where salmon were spawning, the water thick with their silver bodies, and there, pressed deep into the mud beside the water, we found the footprints. The fire popped softly, a small sound that seemed magnified in the attentive silence that had fallen over the room. Outside, a carriage passed in the street below, its wheels hissing through the rain-slicked cobblestones, and then the sound faded, leaving us once more in our bubble of quietude and mystery." "Describe them," Holmes said, and his voice had taken on that particular quality of focused intensity that I knew meant every faculty of his remarkable mind was engaged. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his hands moving as if to shape the memory in the air between us. They were enormous, as I mentioned in my letter, 18 inches from heel to toe, perhaps 6 inches across at the widest point. But it was not merely the size that arrested my attention. The prints showed remarkable detail, pressed as they were into soft clay that had preserved every ridge and contour. 5 toes, each one clearly defined, with what appeared to be dermal ridges similar to human fingerprints, but far more widely spaced. The depth was extraordinary, suggesting a weight of perhaps 500 pounds or more, distributed across a foot that, while similar in general structure to a human foot, was far broader and showed adaptations for gripping uneven terrain. Holmes had set his pipe aside entirely now and had risen from his chair to pace slowly before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in concentration. "And your guide?" he asked without pausing in his measured stride. What was his reaction? A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips, though it held more sadness than amusement. Similano stood very still for a long time, studying the prints without speaking. Then he said simply, "We should leave this place. They do not like to be disturbed." But I, in my scholarly arrogance, insisted on making plaster casts, on measuring and photographing, on documenting everything with scientific precision. He reached down to the large leather satchel he had placed beside his chair and began to unbuckle it with slow, deliberate movements. I have those casts with me, along with much else that I have gathered in the years since that first encounter. From the satchel, he withdrew several objects wrapped in cloth, handling them with the reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. The first he unwrapped was indeed a plaster cast, and even in the flickering firelight I could see the remarkable detail preserved in the white surface. Holmes took it from him with careful hands, carrying it closer to the lamp on the writing desk, and I rose to join him in examining this extraordinary artifact. The cast showed exactly what Blackwood had described, a footprint that was undeniably humanoid in its basic architecture, yet possessed proportions and details that set it apart from any human foot I had ever encountered in my medical career. The toes were longer, more prehensile in appearance, and the arch was far less pronounced, as if designed for a creature that spent its life traversing rough, uneven ground rather than the flat surfaces preferred by civilized man. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, his long fingers tracing the edges of the cast without quite touching it. The depth of the heel impression suggests a heel-strike gait similar to human walking, yet the toe spread indicates significant time spent barefoot in natural environments, allowing the foot to develop without the constraints of footwear. He looked up at Blackwood, his gray eyes sharp as flint. "You mentioned additional evidence." The professor nodded and reached again into his satchel, this time producing a small glass vial containing what appeared to be coarse hair, dark and thick, collected from a low-hanging branch where something had passed through, leaving behind these samples caught in the rough bark, he explained, handing the vial to Holmes. "I have examined them under microscope and found them unlike any known North American mammal. The medulla, the cellular structure within each hair, shows patterns more similar to human hair than to bear or any other large animal, yet the thickness and coarseness exceed human parameters significantly." Holmes held the vial up to the lamplight, his expression unreadable, and I could almost see the machinery of his mind at work, cataloging, comparing, analyzing. The rain had softened again to a gentle whisper, and somewhere in the building, a door closed with a distant, muffled sound that seemed to come from another world entirely. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard briefly on the floor below, and then silence returned, wrapping around us like a comfortable blanket. "Professor," Holmes said at last, returning both the cast and the vial to Blackwood's care, "these are certainly intriguing physical specimens, and they warrant serious investigation. But physical evidence can be manufactured, however skillfully, by those with sufficient knowledge and resources. What convinced you, personally and beyond scientific doubt, that these creatures exist?" The question hung in the air between them, and I saw Blackwood's expression change, a shadow passing across his weathered features like clouds across the face of the moon. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing us to lean forward slightly to catch his words. "Because I saw one," he said simply. 3 years ago, at dawn, in an alpine meadow at the edge of the tree line, I was alone, having left my camp before first light to observe the morning habits of mountain goats. The air was cold, so cold that my breath formed clouds, and the world was utterly silent save for the distant sound of a waterfall and the occasional call of a raven. He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I had settled myself behind an outcropping of rock, my binoculars trained on the slope above, when movement in my peripheral vision caused me to turn. And there, perhaps 70 yards distant, emerging from the forest into the meadow, it stood. The fire had burned down somewhat, and Holmes moved without speaking to add another log, the action so smooth and quiet that it barely disturbed the spell of Blackwood's narrative. The new wood caught quickly, and fresh light bloomed in the grate, sending dancing shadows across the walls and ceiling. I realized that my heart was beating faster, caught up in the tale despite my natural skepticism, and I wondered if this was how ancient humans had felt, gathered around fires much like this one, listening to stories of the world beyond the circle of light. It was massive, Blackwood continued, his voice steady now, as if he had committed every detail of the encounter to memory so thoroughly that the telling had become almost ritualistic. Far larger than any man, perhaps 8 feet in height, with shoulders so broad that it seemed almost impossibly proportioned. The body was covered entirely in dark, shaggy hair that moved in the morning breeze, and the arms hung long, reaching nearly to the knees. The face, Holmes prompted gently when Blackwood paused again, and I noticed that even my friend's usually impassive expression had taken on a quality of intense focus that bordered on fascination. The professor nodded slowly. The face was the most disturbing aspect, for it was neither wholly human nor wholly animal, but something caught between. The brow was heavy, pronounced, casting the eyes in shadow, but when it turned and the early light caught its features, I saw intelligence there, unmistakable and undeniable. It stood in the meadow for perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt like hours, and it seemed to be listening, testing the air, aware of its surroundings with a presence that spoke of perfect adaptation to its environment. He reached for his teacup again, found it empty, and Holmes immediately rose to refill it, the simple act of hospitality grounding us all back in the familiar comfort of the room. Then, without haste or apparent alarm, it turned and walked back into the forest, its gait smooth and powerful, and within moments it had vanished as if it had never been. I watched as Blackwood accepted the refreshed cup of tea from Holmes, his hand steadier now, as if the telling of his experience had somehow lessened the burden of carrying it alone. The lamplight caught the steam rising from the cup, creating small spirals that reminded me of spirits ascending, and outside the rain had shifted direction, driven by a wind that had begun to rise from the east, carrying with it the scent of the river and the 1,000 chimneys of London. Holmes had returned to his chair, but did not sit, instead standing behind it, with his hands resting lightly on the leather back, his posture that of a man deep in contemplation. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the passage of time with its gentle mechanical heartbeat, each tick a small reassurance that the world continued in its ordinary rhythms even as we discussed matters that challenged the very notion of the ordinary. After that morning, Blackwood said, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject, I could no longer approach my research with detached academic curiosity. I had witnessed something that should not exist according to every biological text, every zoological classification, every comfortable assumption about the natural world that my education had instilled in me, and yet there it had been, as real as these walls around us, as solid as the ground beneath my feet. He sipped his tea slowly, savoring the warmth, and I noticed how the simple act seemed to anchor him in the present moment. I began to focus my efforts entirely on gathering evidence, on documenting every story, every sighting, every trace that might prove what I had seen. The indigenous peoples, once they understood that I believed them, that I was not there to mock or dismiss their knowledge, became invaluable allies in this quest. Holmes finally settled into his chair, his long frame folding with practiced ease, and he steepled his fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture that I had come to associate with his deepest concentration. "Tell us about the phonograph recordings," he said, and I heard in his voice that particular note of scientific interest that meant he was treating this not as fantasy, but as a legitimate investigation. Blackwood's face brightened somewhat, though the shadows remained in his eyes. "Ah, yes. Those are perhaps among the most compelling pieces of evidence, for they cannot be explained away as misidentification or the products of poor lighting and distance. He set down his teacup and reached once more into his seemingly bottomless satchel, withdrawing a wooden case of polished walnut that bore the unmistakable markings of precision craftsmanship. I acquired an Edison phonograph specifically for field recording, hoping to capture the vocalizations that witnesses consistently described. Opening the case with reverent care, he revealed the gleaming brass and steel mechanism within, along with several wax cylinders, carefully cushioned in velvet-lined compartments. The device itself was a marvel of modern invention, though I had seen such machines before, and there was something almost incongruous about this symbol of technological progress being employed in the pursuit of a creature from the world's most ancient forests. It took months of patient waiting, Blackwood explained as he began the delicate process of preparing the phonograph for demonstration. I would set up the equipment in locations where sightings had been reported, in areas where the indigenous guides assured me the creatures passed through regularly, night after night of silence, of cold, of disappointment. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, handling the cylinder with extreme care as he fitted it onto the mandrel. Until one night in late autumn, when the moon was nearly full and the forest lay quiet under the first frost of the season, the room had grown darker as evening deepened toward night, and Holmes rose to light another lamp, the warm glow spreading to illuminate our small gathering more completely. I found myself drawn forward in my seat, anticipating what we were about to hear with a mixture of scholarly curiosity and something more primal, an atavistic awareness that we were about to encounter something that spoke to fears and wonders buried deep in the human psyche. Blackwood positioned the phonograph's reproducer carefully on the cylinder's surface, his movements slow and deliberate, and in the silence that preceded the playback, I became acutely aware of every sound in the room, the settling of the fire, the soft susurration of our breathing, the rain against the windows like patient fingers tapping for entrance. I was camped in a valley known to the local peoples as a migration route, Blackwood said quietly, his hand poised above the device. The evening had been unremarkable, clear and cold, and I was beginning to think it would be another night of nothing when, shortly after midnight, I heard movement in the forest surrounding my camp, something large moving with surprising stealth through the underbrush. He engaged the mechanism, and the cylinder began to rotate with a soft whirring sound that seemed almost hypnotic in its regularity. I activated the recording apparatus and waited, scarcely daring to breathe. For a moment, there was only the hiss and crackle of the wax surface, the imperfections of the medium creating a soundscape like distant static, and then, emerging from that white noise, came a sound unlike anything I had encountered in all my travels and experiences. It began as a low moan, resonant and powerful, vibrating through the phonograph's horn with such presence that I felt it in my chest. The vocalization rose and fell in pitch, containing within it notes that seemed almost musical, yet remained fundamentally inhuman, too deep for any human throat, too complex for any simple animal call. There was intelligence in that sound, communication of some kind, though what message it carried remained utterly alien to my comprehension. The call continued for perhaps 15 seconds, modulating through ranges that suggested emotional content, distress or warning, or perhaps simple announcement of presence, and then it faded into the background sounds of the forest, leaving only the mechanical hiss of the cylinder. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with fascination. "Play it again," he requested, and Blackwood obligingly reset the cylinder, allowing us to hear the extraordinary vocalization a second time. On this repetition, I tried to analyze it more carefully to break down the component parts of the sound, but it defied easy categorization. It was not the roar of a bear, nor the howl of a wolf, nor the scream of a mountain lion, all sounds with which I had some familiarity through documented recordings. This was something other, something that existed in a category all its own. I have consulted with experts in animal communication across 3 continents, Blackwood said, as the recording concluded for the second time. None can identify the source with any certainty. The frequency range, the complexity of modulation, the sheer power required to produce such volume, all point to a large primate, yet no known primate inhabits the regions of North America where this was recorded. The fire crackled softly, and I realized that fully night had fallen beyond our windows, transforming the glass into dark mirrors that reflected our small gathering back at us, 3 men huddled in lamplight, discussing matters that seemed to belong more properly to legend than to the modern age of steam and science. Holmes had risen again and was pacing, his movements slow and measured, each step deliberate as he processed the information we had received. "Professor Blackwood," he said at length, pausing before the window to gaze out at the rain-swept street, "you mentioned in your letter that you have come seeking my assistance not merely to validate your findings, but because something has occurred recently that troubles you beyond the question of whether these creatures exist. What is the nature of this new development?" A shadow crossed Blackwood's face, and I saw his jaw tighten, muscles working beneath the weathered skin. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of genuine concern that had been absent even when describing his face-to-face encounter. 3 months ago, a logging operation began in a valley that the indigenous peoples consider sacred, a place they have long warned should remain undisturbed. The company, backed by wealthy investors from San Francisco, has been cutting old-growth timber at a rate that staggers the imagination, penetrating deeper into wilderness that has known no human presence since time immemorial. He paused to collect his thoughts, his fingers drumming against his knee in a nervous rhythm. Shortly after the logging began, workers started disappearing. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Holmes turned from the window, his expression grave. "Disappearing," he repeated. "Elaborate, if you would." Blackwood nodded slowly, reaching into his satchel once more and withdrawing a sheaf of papers that I could see were newspaper clippings, letters, and what appeared to be official reports. At first, it was assumed the men had simply abandoned their posts, for the work is brutal and the conditions harsh, and turnover in such operations is typically high. But then personal effects began to be found, equipment left behind, wages uncollected. In total, 7 men have vanished over the past 3 months, each disappearance occurring in the deep forest, away from the main camp, always during the hours of darkness or early dawn. He spread the papers on the small table between us, and Holmes moved closer to examine them, his eyes scanning the text with that remarkable speed that allowed him to absorb vast quantities of information in moments. I leaned in as well, catching glimpses of dates and descriptions, witness statements, and official correspondence. One clipping featured a crude illustration of enormous footprints found near the site of one disappearance, and another contained testimony from a foreman describing sounds in the night that had terrified his workers. "The logging company wishes to suppress the stories naturally," Blackwood continued, fearing that superstition will drive away what remains of their workforce. But the local indigenous communities are convinced that the Saskets are defending their territory, driving away those who desecrate the sacred places. And I, who have spent years studying these creatures with nothing but respect and fascination, find myself confronted with the possibility that they may be capable of deliberate harm, perhaps even violence against those they perceive as threats. Holmes gathered the papers carefully, arranging them in some order that made sense to his methodical mind, and I watched the play of emotions across his usually impassive features, seeing there the struggle between rational skepticism and the accumulated weight of evidence that could not be easily dismissed. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, rattling the windows in their frames with a sound like bones shaking, and the fire responded by dancing higher as if eager to provide comfort against the encroaching darkness and mystery. "There is another possibility that must be considered," Holmes said quietly, returning to his chair and regarding Blackwood with penetrating intensity. "That the disappearances have nothing whatsoever to do with your forest creatures, but are instead the work of human agency, perhaps individuals using the local legends as cover for more mundane crimes." Blackwood met Holmes's gaze without flinching, and I saw in his expression the weariness of a man who had already considered every alternative explanation and found them all wanting in some essential way. The lamplight flickered as a draft found its way through some unseen crack in the window frame, causing the shadows to dance across the walls like living things engaged in their own mysterious ballet. I had entertained that very thought myself. the professor said, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone who had rehearsed this argument many times in the solitude of his own mind. Indeed, it would be the more comfortable conclusion, for human evil, however disturbing, falls within the realm of the known and the manageable. But there are details, Mr. Holmes, details that resist such rational explanation. He leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as if in prayer or supplication. The firelight caught the deep lines of his face, transforming them into canyons and valleys that spoke of long years spent under open skies and the weight of impossible knowledge. The first man to disappear was a timber faller named Jacob Hendricks, a Norwegian immigrant of considerable size and strength, not a man who could be easily overcome by ordinary means. His axe was found embedded in a tree precisely where he had been working, his coat hanging from a nearby branch, but Jacob himself had vanished as completely as morning mist beneath the sun. Blackwood's voice had taken on a rhythmic quality, the cadence of a storyteller who understood the power of measured revelation. The search party found tracks leading away from the site, tracks that matched the casts I have shown you, tracks that measured 18 inches and were pressed so deep into the forest floor that the searchers estimated the weight at well over 400 pounds. Holmes had retrieved his pipe and was turning it over in his hands, a gesture I recognized as indicative of intense concentration rather than any desire to smoke. The tobacco had long since grown cold, but the familiar object seemed to provide him with a touchstone for his racing thoughts. "And the subsequent disappearances followed similar patterns?" he inquired, his gray eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. The professor nodded slowly, reaching for one of the newspaper clippings and holding it toward the lamplight so that we might better see the details. Each one occurred in areas of the forest where the logging had been most aggressive, where the oldest and largest trees were being felled. And in each case, those massive footprints were found near the site, along with other signs that the indigenous guides interpreted as markers of territorial warning. Rain continued its patient assault upon the windows, and I found myself thinking of those vast forests so far from the civilized comfort of our Baker Street rooms, of darkness beneath ancient trees where sunlight rarely penetrated, of spaces where human rules and human understanding held no sway. Mrs. Hudson had retired for the evening, and the building had grown quiet around us, leaving only our small circle of lamplight as a bastion against the encompassing night. "What manner of markers?" Holmes asked, setting his pipe aside and leaning back in his chair, his fingers once more forming that characteristic steeple beneath his chin. Blackwood's expression grew troubled, and he was silent for a moment before answering, as if gathering the courage to speak of things that challenged his scientific worldview even as he had witnessed them. "Arrangements of branches and stones," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Formations that could not occur naturally, that showed clear evidence of intelligent design. Trees bent and twisted in ways that required tremendous strength, their trunks arched over pathways as if creating archways or barriers. And sounds, always sounds in the night, vocalizations like the one I recorded for you, but also wood-knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing through the valleys in patterns that suggested communication between multiple individuals." He paused, and I saw his hands trembling slightly. The workers who remained spoke of being watched, of feeling eyes upon them as they worked, of shadows moving at the periphery of vision that disappeared when looked at directly. Several refused to continue, abandoning good wages rather than spend another night in those haunted woods. The fire had burned down again, and this time I took it upon myself to add wood, selecting pieces that would burn slowly and steadily, providing warmth and light without the dramatic flaring that might disturb the flow of Blackwood's narrative. As I settled the logs into place, I felt the heat against my face and hands, a sensation that connected me to countless generations of humans who had gathered around fires to share stories of the unknown and the unknowable. When I returned to my seat, I noticed that Holmes had retrieved a map from his desk, spreading it across his lap and studying it with intense focus. "This valley where the logging operation is centered," he said without looking up from the map. "What are the precise coordinates, and what is the nature of the surrounding terrain?" Blackwood rose from his chair and moved to stand beside Holmes, his finger tracing paths across the paper that represented mountains and rivers, forests and settlements in the abstract language of cartography. "Here," he said, indicating a region marked with the sparse notation that suggested territory largely unexplored and unmapped by European standards. The valley runs north to south, approximately 15 miles in length and perhaps 3 miles at its widest point. It is bounded on the east by a range of mountains that remain snow-capped year-round, and on the west by a series of steep ridges covered in old-growth forest. There is only one practical entrance to the valley from the south, where a river has cut a passage through the rock, and the logging company has established its main camp at this entrance, using the river to transport cut timber downstream to the sawmills near the coast. Holmes traced the features with his own finger, his lips moving silently as he calculated distances and considered geographical relationships. "A natural fortress," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Easily defended, difficult to access, the perfect refuge for creatures that value isolation above all else." He looked up at Blackwood, and I saw a decision crystallizing in his expression. "Professor, I believe this matter warrants personal investigation. The evidence you have presented is compelling enough to justify the journey, and the question of the missing men demands resolution, regardless of the ultimate explanation." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication through my consciousness, and I realized with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that we were about to embark upon an adventure unlike any we had undertaken before. Blackwood's face showed relief so profound that it seemed to shave years from his weathered features. "You will come then? You will see for yourself?" His voice carried a note of hope that spoke to the loneliness of his long vigil, the burden of knowledge that others dismissed or ridiculed. Holmes nodded, already rising from his chair with that sudden energy that always accompanied the beginning of a new investigation. "We will depart as soon as arrangements can be made. Watson, I trust you are amenable to a journey that may test your tolerance for wilderness conditions and challenge your assumptions about the natural world." He looked at me with that familiar gleam in his eye, the look that said he already knew my answer but appreciated the courtesy of asking. I smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of purpose that always accompanied our adventures. My practice can spare me, and I confess my curiosity is thoroughly aroused. "When do we leave?" The practicalities of the journey began to take shape as Holmes moved to his desk and started making notes with swift, decisive strokes of his pen. "We will need to arrange passage to Liverpool and from there across the Atlantic to British Columbia. Assuming favorable conditions, we should be able to reach the valley within 3 weeks of departure." He glanced at Blackwood. "I assume you can provide letters of introduction to your contacts among the indigenous peoples and facilitate our access to the logging operation." The professor nodded eagerly, already reaching into his satchel for his own notebooks and correspondence. "I have maintained excellent relations with the Sequapemic elders, and I have correspondence with the logging company's regional manager, though I cannot guarantee a warm reception given the circumstances." The clock struck 11, its chimes soft and melodious, marking how swiftly the evening had passed in discussion of matters so strange they seemed to belong to another world entirely. Yet here we were, making concrete plans to journey across an ocean and into wilderness in pursuit of creatures that science said could not exist, following a trail of disappearances that might be explained by mundane violence or might represent something far more extraordinary. Holmes continued writing, his pen scratching across paper with the sound of dry leaves blown across stone, while Blackwood provided details of contacts and locations, of seasons and weather patterns, of all the practical considerations that such an expedition would require. I found my thoughts drifting to the journey ahead, to forests I had only read about in the accounts of explorers and naturalists, to mountains that dwarfed anything Europe could offer, to the possibility of encountering something that would rewrite our understanding of the world's hidden corners. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, barely audible against the windows, and the fire had settled into a steady glow that required no further tending. In the lamplight, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of Holmes's rooms with maps spread across surfaces and the scent of old paper mingling with tobacco and tea, the adventure was already beginning to feel real, no longer mere speculation, but a path we had committed to walking regardless of where it might lead. "There is one more thing you should know," Blackwood said as the evening drew toward its close, and something in his tone caused both Holmes and myself to look up from our respective contemplations. The professor had returned to his chair, and his face showed the exhaustion of a man who had traveled far and unburdened himself of secrets long carried in isolation. The indigenous peoples speak of these creatures not merely as animals to be avoided or respected, but as something more, something that occupies a space between the human and the natural world. They have stories, ancient stories, of times when communication was possible between the peoples, of mutual respect and shared territories. But they also speak of a great severing, a time when trust was broken and the Saskets withdrew deeper into the wilderness, becoming shadows and whispers rather than neighbors. The weight of Blackwood's words settled over the room like snow falling on a winter forest, soft and inexorable, transforming the familiar landscape of our thoughts into something strange and hushed. Holmes had ceased his note-taking and stood motionless by his desk, his profile sharp against the lamplight, while I felt myself drawn even further into the mystery that seemed to deepen with each revelation. The fire whispered its own commentary, sending small sparks upward into the darkness of the chimney, and somewhere in the building a pipe knocked as the heating system adjusted to the cooling night. These small, ordinary sounds served only to emphasize the extraordinary nature of what we were discussing. The collision of the mundane and the mythical in our comfortable Victorian sanctuary. "Tell us of this severing," Holmes said softly, returning to his chair and settling into it with the patience of a man prepared to listen for as long as necessary. Blackwood's eyes had taken on a distant quality, looking beyond the walls of our room toward memories and stories gathered around fires in forests thousands of miles away. The details vary between different tribal groups, as oral traditions always do, but the essential narrative remains consistent. Long ago, in the time before the Europeans came, when the world was younger and the boundaries between things were less fixed, the Saskets and the human peoples lived in a state of careful coexistence. They were not friends, precisely, for they were too different for true friendship, but they maintained territories and observed protocols, and each respected the other's place in the great web of existence. He paused to sip from his teacup, finding it had grown cold, and I rose quietly to refill it from the pot that Mrs. Hudson had left warming by the hearth. The simple act of service gave my hands something to do while my mind grappled with concepts that seemed to belong more properly to fairy tales than to serious investigation. Blackwood accepted the fresh cup with a grateful nod and continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of practiced storytelling. But then came a winter of terrible hardship, when the snows fell deeper than any could remember, and the game animals retreated to hidden valleys where neither human nor Saskets could follow. Hunger stalked both peoples, and in desperation, boundaries were crossed. A group of human hunters ventured into territory that had been understood as belonging to the forest people, and there they killed a young Saskets, mistaking it in the blizzard for a bear. The rain had ceased entirely now, leaving behind a profound silence that seemed to amplify every small sound within our rooms. I could hear the settling of coals in the grate, the gentle ticking of the clock, the almost imperceptible sound of our own breathing. Holmes sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Blackwood with an intensity that suggested he was committing every word, every inflection, every detail to his remarkable memory. "The death of the young one shattered the ancient understanding," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping even lower, as if speaking of sacred things that demanded reverence. The Saskets withdrew into the deepest wilderness, becoming creatures of shadow and silence, avoiding all contact with humans except in those rare moments when circumstances forced an encounter, and from that time forward they have been slowly fading from the world, retreating before the advance of human settlement, their numbers dwindling as their territories shrink. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a small shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room with dancing light before subsiding back into steady glow. I thought of the tragedy implicit in the story, the breaking of trust that could never be fully mended, the long, slow extinction of beings who had once walked the earth with a dignity and presence all their own. "And now," Holmes said, his voice cutting through my melancholy reflections, "the logging operation represents another incursion, perhaps the final one, into territory they consider inviolable, if we accept the premise that these creatures exist and possess intelligence sufficient to understand cause and effect, to recognize threats and respond to them. Then the disappearances could indeed represent a form of retaliation or defense." Blackwood nodded gravely, setting down his teacup with a soft clink of porcelain. "That is precisely my fear, Mr. Holmes. Not merely that the Saskets exist, which I know beyond doubt, but that human greed and ignorance may be pushing them toward actions that will ultimately doom them. For if they harm humans, if they cross that final boundary, then no amount of scientific interest or cultural respect will save them from extermination. The logging companies will bring in hunters, armed expeditions, perhaps even military force, and creatures that have survived for countless generations will be hunted to extinction within a single season." The thought hung heavy in the air, a weight of responsibility that seemed to press down upon us all. Holmes rose and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to gaze out at the nighttime street below, where gas lamps cast pools of yellow light on wet cobblestones, and the occasional late pedestrian hurried past with collar turned up against the damp. "Then time is of the essence," he said without turning. "Every day that passes increases the likelihood of further disappearances, further conflict, further narrowing of the possibility for peaceful resolution. We must move with all possible speed." He let the curtain fall back into place and turned to face us. And in his expression, I saw the determination that had driven him to solve countless mysteries, but also something else, something softer that might have been compassion for creatures caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The rest of the evening passed in detailed planning, with Blackwood providing information about routes and resources, contacts and contingencies, while Holmes organized everything with the methodical precision that characterized all his endeavors. I contributed what I could, my medical knowledge and experience with wilderness travel from my military service proving useful in discussions of supplies and health precautions. As midnight approached, we had outlined a comprehensive plan that would see us departing London within 3 days, allowing time for Holmes to settle certain outstanding matters, and for me to arrange leave from my practice. Blackwood, who had been traveling for weeks and showed the strain in every line of his weathered face, finally rose to take his leave, gathering his precious evidence back into the leather satchel with gentle care. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude," he said as he stood by the door, his hand resting on the knob, but his eyes moving between Holmes and myself. "To have one's experiences validated, to no longer carry this burden alone, is a gift beyond measure." Holmes extended his hand in that firm grip that sealed agreements and acknowledged shared purpose. "We seek truth, Professor, wherever it may lead us. Whether we find mysterious primates or human criminals or something else entirely, we will uncover what lies behind these disappearances and bring light to the darkness." Blackwood shook my hand as well, and I felt the strength in his grip despite his exhaustion, the resilience of a man who had endured much and would endure more. "Rest well," I told him. "The journey ahead will demand much of us all." After he had gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairs and fading into the night, Holmes and I stood in silence for a long moment, each processing in our own way the extraordinary nature of what we had committed ourselves to. The fire had burned low again, casting the room in shadows that seemed deeper and more mysterious than before. Holmes moved to bank the coals for the night, his movements slow and contemplative, while I began tidying the tea things, the familiar domestic routine grounding us back in the ordinary world even as our minds raced ahead to extraordinary possibilities. "Watson," Holmes said as he straightened from the fireplace, his face barely visible in the dim light, "what do you make of it all? Your honest assessment, free from the politeness one shows a guest." I considered the question carefully, measuring my words as I would diagnose a patient, attempting to balance skepticism with open-mindedness. "The physical evidence is compelling but not conclusive. The footprint casts could be manufactured, though they would require considerable skill and anatomical knowledge. The hair samples deserve laboratory analysis by independent experts. The phonograph recording is certainly unusual, but without comparison to the full range of animal vocalizations from that region, definitive identification remains impossible." I paused, organizing my thoughts. But Blackwood himself, his sincerity, his obvious struggle to reconcile what he has witnessed with his scientific training, those factors give me pause. He is either a consummate actor engaged in an elaborate hoax for purposes I cannot fathom, or he has genuinely encountered something that has shaken his understanding of the natural world. Holmes nodded slowly, and in the dying light I could just make out the ghost of a smile on his lips. Well-reasoned, old friend. I find myself in substantial agreement. The mystery has sufficient depth to warrant investigation, and the human element, the disappearances, would alone justify our involvement, even if the question of unknown primates were set entirely aside. He moved toward his bedroom, pausing at the doorway to look back at me. Pack for extended wilderness travel, Watson. Bring your service revolver and your warmest clothing. We journey into territory where the rules we take for granted may not apply, where the line between the known and the unknown grows thin as morning mist. With that cryptic statement, he disappeared into his room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the fading fire. I stood for a while in the quiet room, listening to the settling sounds of the building, the distant rumble of late-night traffic, the whisper of wind against the windows. My mind turned over the evening's revelations like a jeweler examining stones, looking for flaws and authenticity in equal measure. 3 days later found us aboard a steam train racing northward through the English countryside toward Liverpool, the landscape flowing past our window in shades of green and gray beneath a sky that seemed perpetually poised between rain and clearing. Holmes sat across from me in our private compartment, his long legs stretched out, his eyes closed, though I knew he was far from sleeping. He had that peculiar stillness about him that indicated deep thought, his mind working through problems and possibilities while his body remained at rest. I had brought several books for the journey, medical journals and a novel by Stevenson, but found myself unable to concentrate on the printed page, my attention drawn instead to the passing scenery and the anticipation of what lay ahead. The compartment was warm and comfortable, appointed with the subdued luxury that characterized first-class railway travel, the seats upholstered in deep burgundy velvet that had absorbed the scents of countless previous journeys. A small brass lamp swayed gently with the motion of the train, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the polished wood paneling. Outside, the farms and villages of rural England presented a scene of pastoral tranquility that seemed worlds removed from the dark forests and missing men that occupied our thoughts. Sheep grazed on hillsides dotted with ancient stone walls, and church spires rose from clusters of cottages like fingers pointing toward heaven, markers of human presence and civilization that would soon give way to the vast, untamed spaces of the New World. Holmes opened his eyes as we passed through a small station, the platform a blur of waiting passengers and stacked luggage, and reached into his traveling case to withdraw the notes he had been compiling since our meeting with Blackwood. "I have been considering the psychological aspects of this case," he said without preamble, his voice carrying easily over the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. "Assuming for the moment that these creatures exist as described, we must ask ourselves what manner of intelligence we are dealing with. Are they purely instinctual beings, operating on the same level as bears or wolves, or do they possess cognitive abilities that approach or even parallel human reasoning?" He tapped the papers thoughtfully against his knee. "The evidence suggests the latter, which presents both opportunities and complications." I set aside my unread book, grateful for the engagement. The territorial markers Blackwood described would seem to indicate sophisticated communication and perhaps even symbolic thinking, I offered. And the pattern of the disappearances, if indeed they are connected to these creatures, suggests strategic behavior rather than random predation. Holmes nodded approvingly, that slight upturn of his lips that indicated I had followed his reasoning correctly. "Precisely. If we are dealing with intelligent beings defending territory they consider sacred or essential to their survival, then we may have the possibility of communication, of negotiation, of finding a solution that does not end in bloodshed for either humans or Saskets." He paused, gazing out at the passing landscape. "But it also means we must approach them not as animals to be studied or captured, but as sovereign entities with their own agency and motivations, deserving of respect and caution in equal measure." The train began to slow as we approached another station, and the conductor's voice could be heard in the corridor announcing our arrival with practiced efficiency. Passengers disembarked and embarked, their voices and footsteps briefly animating the platform before fading as the train resumed its journey. I watched an elderly woman being helped aboard by a young man, probably her grandson, their faces showing that mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied all significant journeys, and I wondered what they would think if they knew that their fellow passengers were bound for an encounter with creatures from legend. The thought brought a smile to my lips, and Holmes, catching my expression, raised an inquiring eyebrow. "Just reflecting on the strangeness of our profession," I explained. "A week ago I was treating Mrs. Pemberton's rheumatism and Mr. Davies's persistent cough, and now I am traveling across the Atlantic in search of cryptozoological mysteries." Holmes's smile broadened into something approaching genuine amusement. The variety of experience is indeed one of the profession's chief attractions, though I suspect Mrs. Pemberton's rheumatism may prove more predictable than what awaits us in British Columbia. He returned his attention to his notes, and I watched as his eyes moved across the pages with that remarkable speed that allowed him to absorb and retain vast quantities of information. The afternoon wore on, marked by the passage of stations and the gradual shift of landscape as we drew closer to the industrial north, the pastoral scenes giving way to signs of mining and manufacturing, the green hills interrupted by chimneys and warehouses that spoke of England's transformation from agricultural to industrial power. We reached Liverpool as dusk was settling over the city, the great port sprawling before us in a maze of docks and warehouses, ship's masts rising like a forest of bare trees against the darkening sky. The air here smelled of salt and coal smoke, of tar and fish, and the peculiar mineral scent of the sea itself, so different from London's Thames-side odors, yet familiar in its urban intensity. We had booked passage on the Empress of Britain, a modern steamship that would carry us across the Atlantic in relative comfort, a journey that would have taken our grandfathers months by sail, but could now be accomplished in less than 2 weeks. Our hotel for the night was near the waterfront, a substantial brick building that catered to travelers awaiting departure, and after settling into our rooms and taking a simple dinner, I found myself standing at the window of my chamber, looking out at the lights of ships at anchor and thinking of the journey ahead. Sleep came slowly that night, my mind too active with anticipation and the residual excitement of travel. I dozed fitfully, waking at intervals to hear the distant sounds of the port, the calls of night workers loading cargo, the mournful horns of ships signaling their presence in the darkness. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed the hours, and each time I woke, I noted the passage of time, counting down toward morning and the beginning of our voyage. When dawn finally arrived, gray and soft with the promise of rain, I rose, feeling both weary and energized, the paradoxical state of beginning a great adventure. Holmes was already awake when I knocked on his door, fully dressed and reviewing the latest telegrams that had arrived during the night, correspondence with contacts in Canada who would facilitate our journey once we made landfall. The morning was consumed with the practicalities of boarding, the inspection of tickets and luggage, the navigation of crowded gangways where porters shouted and families said tearful farewells, and the organized chaos of departure transformed the dock into a theater of human drama. The Empress of Britain was an impressive vessel, her black hull rising high above the waterline, her twin funnels painted in the distinctive livery of the shipping line, her superstructure a marvel of modern engineering that promised safety and speed in crossing the unpredictable Atlantic. We found our cabin, a compact but well-appointed space, with 2 bunks, a small writing desk, and a porthole that would provide our window to the ocean during the crossing. Holmes immediately appropriated the desk for his papers and instruments, spreading out his materials with the efficiency of long practice, while I stowed our luggage and arranged my own possessions. The ship's horn sounded deep and resonant, vibrating through the very structure of the vessel, announcing our imminent departure. I made my way to the deck, finding a position along the rail where I could watch as the great ship was eased away from the dock by tugboats, their smaller forms somehow reassuring in their competent maneuvering. The gap between ship and shore widened gradually, the water churning white with the action of propellers in the tide, and I felt that peculiar sensation of severance that accompanies all departures, the physical cutting of ties to solid ground and familiar places. Other passengers crowded the rails as well, waving to figures on the dock who grew smaller and less distinct with each passing moment, and I heard around me a babble of languages and accents, for the Empress carried travelers from across Europe bound for new lives or brief visits to the vast territories of North America. Holmes joined me as we cleared the harbor and felt the first swells of the open ocean, the ship beginning to move with that distinctive rolling motion that separated maritime from terrestrial experience. He stood quietly beside me, his hands resting on the rail, his eyes fixed on the horizon where sea met sky in a line so perfect it might have been drawn with a ruler. "We have crossed the Rubicon now, Watson," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind and the rush of water along the hull. "Whatever we discover in those forests, whatever truth lies behind Blackwood's testimony and the disappearances, we are committed to seeing it through to conclusion." I nodded, feeling the salt spray on my face, tasting the clean sharpness of it on my lips. "I have no regrets," I replied. "Mystery is the spice that makes life palatable, and this particular mystery promises to be exceptionally well seasoned." The Atlantic crossing proved both monotonous and mesmerizing in equal measure, the days blending into one another as the great ship carved its steady path through waters that ranged from mirror calm to moderately turbulent, though we were fortunate to avoid any serious storms. I established a routine of morning walks upon the deck, taking the air and exercising my legs before breakfast, followed by reading in the ship's well-stocked library or in our cabin, while Holmes occupied himself with correspondence and the refinement of his theories regarding what we might encounter. The other passengers were a diverse collection of emigrants seeking new opportunities, businessmen pursuing commercial interests, families visiting relations, and a handful of tourists drawn by the growing reputation of Canada's spectacular scenery. Holmes remained largely aloof from social interaction, declining invitations to join the captain's table and avoiding the evening entertainments that occupied many of our fellow travelers. He spent long hours at the writing desk, composing letters to contacts in North America and consulting the various texts he had brought regarding the natural history and indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest. I observed him one afternoon surrounded by open volumes, comparing accounts from different sources, his fingers moving across the pages with that delicate precision he brought to the examination of physical evidence. "The consistency is remarkable," he murmured, half to himself and half to me. "Accounts separated by decades and hundreds of miles describe essentially the same creature, the same behaviors, the same elusive quality. Either we are dealing with a genuine zoological phenomenon or a cultural archetype so deeply embedded that it shapes perception across vast distances and diverse peoples." On the 5th day of our crossing, I made the acquaintance of a retired Hudson's Bay Company factor named McTavish, a grizzled Scotsman who had spent 30 years in the Canadian wilderness and possessed a wealth of stories about the territories we would soon be entering. We fell into conversation one evening after dinner, settling into leather chairs in the smoking room while the ship rolled gently beneath us and the lamps swayed in their gimbals, creating patterns of moving light across the polished wood panels. McTavish had the weathered complexion of a man who had lived most of his life outdoors, his face creased with lines that spoke of laughter and hardship in equal measure, and his eyes held that particular clarity that comes from years of watching distant horizons. "You're headed to British Columbia, then?" he asked, after we had exchanged the usual pleasantries and established that I was traveling with a companion on what I vaguely described as investigative business. His accent carried the musical lilt of the Highlands overlaid with something harder acquired during his decades in the New World. "Aye, it's magnificent country, though not for the faint of heart. I spent 10 years at a trading post up the Fraser River, and I can tell you that civilization sits light upon that land, like morning dew that burns off the moment the sun grows strong." He drew upon his pipe, the tobacco glowing in the bowl, and exhaled a stream of fragrant smoke that reminded me pleasantly of Holmes's favored mixture. "What brings you to those parts, if you don't mind my asking? Most visitors are content with Victoria or Vancouver, where there's some semblance of proper society. I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, but something in McTavish's open, honest demeanor encouraged confidence. My companion and I are investigating reports of unusual occurrences in the interior, disappearances at a logging operation that may or may not be connected to local legends about forest creatures. I watched his reaction carefully, half expecting skepticism or dismissal, but instead his expression grew thoughtful, and he nodded slowly as if I had confirmed something he had long suspected. "Ah, the wild men," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure we would not be overheard, though the smoking room held only 2 other gentlemen engaged in their own conversation at the far end. "I've heard the stories, and I've seen things myself that I cannot readily explain by reference to bear or elk or any other creature in the naturalists' catalogs." His admission surprised me, and I leaned forward with renewed interest. "You have encountered them?" McTavish drew again upon his pipe, his eyes growing distant as they focused on memories rather than the comfortable surroundings of the smoking room. "Once, perhaps twice, though the second time may have been nothing more than shadows and wishful thinking playing tricks. But the first time, that I am certain of." He paused, organizing his thoughts, and I remained silent, letting him find his own pace. It was winter, deep winter, when the snow lies heavy and the cold can kill a man in hours if he's caught unprepared. I was traveling alone, foolishly perhaps, returning to the post after visiting a native village to the north. The trail followed a frozen stream through country so wild and beautiful it made your heart ache just to witness it. The ship's engines maintained their steady rhythm far below, a mechanical heartbeat that connected us to the modern world, even as McTavish's words transported us to a realm where such conveniences meant nothing. I had stopped to make camp as the light was failing, finding a sheltered spot beneath an overhang where the rock would reflect my fire's heat. As I was gathering wood, I became aware of being watched, that peculiar sensation that raises the hairs on your neck and sets every sense on alert. He met my eyes, and I saw in them the sincerity of true recollection. I turned slowly, scanning the forest, and there, perhaps 50 yards distant at the edge of a clearing, stood a figure unlike anything I had seen before or since. It was massive, Watson, easily 8 feet tall if it was an inch, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the fading light. For perhaps 10 seconds we regarded each other, and in that time I felt no fear, strangely enough, but rather a profound sense of mutual recognition, as if 2 intelligent beings were acknowledging each other's existence across the boundary that separates the civilized from the wild. I found myself holding my breath, captivated by his narrative and the quiet conviction with which he related it. The smoking room had grown very still around us, the other conversations having ceased, and I realized that the 2 gentlemen at the far end had departed without my noticing, leaving McTavish and myself alone with the creaking of the ship and the distant sound of waves against the hull. "What happened then?" I asked softly. He smiled, though the expression held more wonder than amusement. It simply turned and walked away, moving with a grace that belied its size, disappearing into the forest as silently as a thought. I found tracks the next morning, enormous footprints pressed deep into the snow, and I followed them for perhaps a mile before they led into terrain too rough for me to pursue. When I reached the post and told my story, the native workers nodded as if I had reported seeing a deer or a rabbit, something entirely ordinary and expected. "Ah, yes," they said. "The forest people. They sometimes show themselves to those who travel alone and treat the land with respect." We sat in companionable silence for a while, the ship carrying us steadily westward through the darkness, and I thought about how McTavish's account paralleled what Blackwood had told us, the same descriptions, the same sense of intelligence and awareness in the creatures, the same acceptance from the indigenous peoples who had lived alongside these beings for countless generations. "My companion will be very interested to hear your story," I said at length. "He is something of an expert in matters that defy conventional explanation, though his methods are rigorously scientific." McTavish nodded, knocking the ash from his pipe into a brass receptacle. "I would be happy to speak with him. In my experience, the world contains far more mysteries than our philosophies account for, and a wise man keeps his mind open to possibilities that textbooks dismiss." I introduced Holmes to McTavish the following morning, and the two men took to each other immediately, recognizing in one another that combination of keen observation and intellectual honesty that transcended differences in background or profession. They spent hours in deep conversation, Holmes probing for every detail of McTavish's encounter and his knowledge of the territories we would be entering, while the old factor shared not only his own experiences, but also stories he had gathered from trappers, traders, and indigenous informants over his decades in the wilderness. I listened when I could, absorbing information that would prove invaluable in the days ahead, learning about the seasonal patterns of the forests, the locations of native settlements, the challenges of travel through terrain that could shift from gentle to lethal with the turn of the weather. On the 10th day of our crossing, we sighted land, the coast of Newfoundland appearing as a gray smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved into rocky headlands and pine-covered slopes as we drew nearer. The mood aboard ship lifted perceptibly, passengers gathering on deck to catch their first glimpses of the new world, and I felt my own spirits rise with anticipation. We would make port at Halifax, take on coal and provisions, and then continue up the St. Lawrence to Montreal, from where we would board a transcontinental train that would carry us across the vast breadth of Canada to the Pacific coast. The journey that remained would take another week or more, but each mile brought us closer to the mystery that had drawn us across an ocean. The Transcontinental Railway proved to be a revelation in itself, a ribbon of steel stretching across landscapes so vast and varied that they seemed to encompass entire worlds within a single nation. We departed Montreal on a crisp autumn morning, the train pulling away from the station with slow majesty before gathering speed and carrying us westward through forests ablaze with fall colors, maples and birches transformed into torches of gold and crimson against the deep green of evergreens. Holmes had secured us a private compartment once more, and we settled in for the journey with the practiced ease of experienced travelers, arranging our belongings and establishing routines that would make the days of constant motion more bearable. The train stopped frequently at small settlements and larger towns, taking on passengers and cargo, the platform scenes offering glimpses into lives being lived at the edges of civilization, where the boundary between human order and wilderness remained fluid and contested. I watched from our window as farmers loaded grain, as timber workers boarded with axes and saws slung over shoulders, as families said farewells that might last months or forever in a land where distance and danger conspired to separate loved ones. At night, lying in my berth with the darkness pressing against the window and the rails singing their metallic song beneath us, I would sometimes wake and feel the enormousness of the continent surrounding our small bubble of warmth and light. Millions of acres of forest and prairie and mountain ranges that had never known human footsteps. We crossed Ontario's lake country and emerged onto the prairies, where the landscape opened into horizons so distant they seemed to curve with the earth itself, endless grasslands rippling in the wind, like a golden ocean frozen in slow motion. The sky here dominated everything, vast and changeable, clouds building and dissolving in patterns of light and shadow that raced across the land faster than our train could travel. Holmes spent hours at the window during these prairie crossings, his keen eyes studying the flight of birds and the movement of distant herds of what I learned were bison, those great shaggy beasts that had once numbered in the millions but were now diminishing before the advance of agriculture and hunting. "There is a lesson here," he said one afternoon as we watched a small group of bison grazing near the tracks, the animals lifting their massive heads to regard our passing with stolid indifference. "In the displacement of the native megafauna, the transformation of wilderness into farmland, if the Saskats truly exist, they face the same pressures, the same inexorable encroachment of human expansion. The prairies gave way eventually to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and then the mountains themselves rose before us like a wall dividing the continent, their snow-capped peaks piercing clouds and their slopes covered in forests so dense they appeared almost black from a distance. The railway climbed through passes that seemed impossibly narrow, clinging to mountainsides, where a glance out the window revealed dizzying drops to rivers far below, the water white with the violence of its descent. We passed through tunnels blasted from living rock and crossed trestle bridges that swayed alarmingly with the train's weight, engineering marvels that represented both human ingenuity and hubris in equal measure. The air grew thinner and colder, and at night we could see our breath even within our heated compartment, the windows frosting with delicate patterns that reminded me of ferns and feathers. At a stop in the mountain town of Revelstoke, we were met by a representative of Professor Blackwood, a young man named Thomas Whitehorse, who introduced himself as a member of the Secwepemc Nation and a student of natural history who had been assisting the professor in his research. Thomas was in his mid-20s, tall and lean, with the easy physicality of someone equally comfortable in wilderness and settlement, his dark eyes bright with intelligence and a quiet humor that manifested in the slight upturn of his lips, even when his expression was otherwise serious. He wore a mixture of European and indigenous clothing, practical garments suited to travel and work in difficult terrain, and he carried himself with a confidence that immediately earned my respect and Holmes's attention. Professor Blackwood sent word that you would be arriving on this train, Thomas explained as we stood on the platform while porters unloaded luggage and other passengers milled about in the organized confusion of a mountain depot. He has gone ahead to the valley to make arrangements with the logging company and to consult with the elders of my people regarding the situation. I am to guide you from here to the coast and then north to where the valley lies. His English was flawless, but carried an accent that suggested it was not his first language, and I noticed how his eyes constantly scanned our surroundings, taking in details with the habitual awareness of someone trained to read landscapes and situations for information critical to survival. Holmes shook his hand with that firm grip that conveyed respect between equals. "We are grateful for your assistance, Mr. Whitehorse. Your knowledge of the territory and the peoples will be invaluable." We continued westward through the mountains, Thomas joining us in our compartment and providing commentary on the landscape we passed through, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories that brought the seemingly empty wilderness to life with histories of travel and habitation stretching back thousands of years. He spoke of his people's traditional territories, of seasonal movements following salmon runs and game migrations, of the transformation wrought by European contact, and the diseases and displacement that had followed. But he spoke without bitterness, presenting facts with the calm detachment of a historian, though I sensed beneath his measured words a deep connection to the land and a concern for its future that went beyond mere academic interest. "The valley where we are going," he said as we descended the western slopes of the mountains toward the Pacific, "is called Skylex W in my language, which means place of ancient spirits. It has been sacred to my people since the beginning times, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin." Holmes leaned forward with interest, his fingers steepled in that characteristic gesture. "And the Saskats, are they considered spiritual beings or physical creatures in your tradition?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze directed out the window where the forest had changed character, the pines and firs of the interior giving way to the massive cedars and hemlocks of the coastal rainforest, trees of such enormous girth and height that they dwarfed anything I had seen in Europe. "That is a question that does not translate easily," he said at last. "In English, you separate spirit and matter, supernatural and natural, but in our understanding, these categories overlap and interpenetrate. The Saskats are as real as you or I. They eat and sleep and leave footprints in the mud, but they also occupy a different relationship to the world than humans do. They are part of the forest in a way that we are not, even those of us who have lived here since time began." The train emerged from forest into the outskirts of Vancouver, and suddenly we were in a city that was recognizably modern, yet utterly different from London or any European metropolis, a place where wooden buildings mixed with brick and stone, where the streets teemed with a mixture of Europeans, Chinese laborers, indigenous peoples, and adventurers from every corner of the globe, drawn by the promise of timber and fish and the rumored gold in the northern territories. We spent one night in a hotel overlooking the harbor, where ships from across the Pacific rode at anchor, and the smell of the sea mixed with the scent of fresh-cut lumber from the sawmills that lined the waterfront. Holmes and I stood on the balcony of our room as the sun set in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the water and silhouetted the mountains of Vancouver Island across the strait. "Tomorrow we begin the final leg of our journey," Holmes said quietly, his profile sharp against the fading light. "Thomas has arranged for a coastal steamer to take us north to the inlet nearest the valley, and from there we will travel overland to reach the logging camp and meet with Blackwood. He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw not the cool, analytical intelligence that usually dominated his expression, but something warmer, almost excitement tempered with caution. "We are close now, Watson, close to answers that may rewrite our understanding of what is possible in this world. I confess to an anticipation I have rarely felt, for whether we discover genuine unknown primates, or uncover an elaborate deception, or find some explanation that falls between these extremes, the resolution of this mystery will be extraordinary." I nodded, feeling the same mixture of eagerness and apprehension, aware that we stood on the threshold of something that would test not only our investigative skills, but our fundamental assumptions about the natural order. The coastal steamer departed at dawn, a sturdy vessel built for cargo rather than passenger comfort, but seaworthy and well-maintained. Her captain, a Norwegian, who knew these waters as intimately as Holmes knew the streets of London. We steamed north through passages between islands, the water calm and dark as obsidian, reflecting forests that came down to the shoreline in walls of green so dense they appeared impenetrable. Whales surfaced occasionally, their spouts visible at great distances, and eagles circled overhead or perched in the tops of snags, their white heads brilliant against the sky. Thomas pointed out sites of abandoned villages, places where his people had lived for generations before disease and displacement had reduced thriving communities to empty beaches overgrown with salal and salmonberry. We reached the inlet as afternoon light slanted through breaks in the clouds, illuminating the water in shafts of gold that moved across the surface like searching fingers. A small dock extended from the rocky shore, and waiting there with 2 pack horses and supplies for the overland journey was Professor Blackwood himself, his weathered face breaking into a smile of genuine relief as our steamer approached. Blackwood greeted us as we stepped onto the weathered planks of the dock, his handshake firm and his eyes bright with an energy that seemed renewed by our arrival, as if our presence validated his long vigil and lent credence to concerns he had carried in isolation. The forest pressed close around the small clearing where the dock met the land, and the air was thick with the scent of cedar and the rich decomposition of the rainforest floor, a smell utterly different from anything in England, primal and fecund and somehow alive in a way that suggested the forest itself breathed and grew and watched with patient awareness. "Gentlemen, I cannot express how relieved I am to see you," Blackwood said as Thomas began organizing our luggage and supplies with practiced efficiency. "The situation has deteriorated in the weeks since I departed for London. 2 more men have vanished, and the logging company is threatening to bring in armed hunters to eliminate what they persist in calling a bear problem, despite all evidence to the contrary." Holmes's expression grew grave, and he moved away from the dock to examine the surrounding forest with that intensity of focus that transformed observation into something approaching communion with the observed. I watched him take in the enormous trees, some with trunks wider than a London carriage, their bark deeply furrowed and hung with moss that draped like tattered curtains. The canopy far above filtered the light into a green-gold dimness that reduced visibility and created pockets of shadow where anything might hide unseen. "How far to the valley?" Holmes asked, without turning from his examination. Blackwood consulted a pocket watch, then glanced at the sky where the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. 6 hours on horseback if we maintain good pace, but the trail is difficult and dangerous to attempt after dark. I have arranged for us to camp tonight at a site halfway to the valley, a clearing beside a stream where we can safely make fire and rest before completing the journey tomorrow. We set out within the hour, following a trail that was barely discernible to my inexperienced eyes, but which Thomas navigated with casual certainty, leading the pack horses through terrain that shifted between old-growth forest and sections where fire or windstorm had opened the canopy, allowing undergrowth to flourish in tangles of fern and berry bushes. The horses were sure-footed mountain breeds, small but strong, and they picked their way over roots and rocks with a patience that suggested they had made this journey many times before. I rode behind Holmes, who sat his mount with the stiff formality of someone who had learned horsemanship as a necessary skill rather than a pleasure, while Blackwood and Thomas conversed in low tones at the front of our small column, their voices blending with the sounds of the forest, the drip of water from leaves, the calls of ravens, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. As the afternoon wore into evening, the character of the forest began to change in subtle ways that I felt rather than consciously observed. The trees seemed larger, their spacing more regular as if planted by some vast gardener, and the undergrowth thinned to allow easier passage, but also to create sightlines that extended further into the green dimness. Thomas called a halt, raising his hand for silence, and we sat motionless on our horses, while he listened with an intensity that made me suddenly aware of how much sound we had been making, how conspicuous our presence was in this realm of quiet growth and patient watching. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly and turned in his saddle to address us. "We are being observed," he said calmly, his voice pitched low. "Nothing threatening, but the forest is aware of our passage. We should continue, but remain alert." The words sent a chill along my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air, and I found my hand moving unconsciously to touch the reassuring weight of my revolver in its holster beneath my coat. Holmes, I noticed, had grown even more still, his eyes scanning the forest with that peculiar ability he possessed to see patterns and details that others missed. We resumed our journey, the horses' hooves making soft sounds on the carpet of needles and moss, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon us. Not hostile, but intensely curious, evaluating our intentions and our natures with an intelligence that seemed to penetrate beyond surface appearances. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced even in the most dangerous moments of military service, for there I had known the nature of the threat, had understood the parameters within which danger operated. Here, I faced the unknown in its purest form, and the uncertainty was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. We reached the campsite as the last light was fading from the sky, the clearing exactly as Blackwood had described, a level area beside a stream that chuckled and whispered over smooth stones worn round by countless seasons of flowing water. Thomas and Blackwood worked with quiet efficiency to establish our camp, while Holmes and I gathered firewood from the surrounding forest, staying close to the clearing and collecting only deadfalls that snapped with dry cracks under our hands. When the fire was built and blazing cheerfully, pushing back the darkness and creating a circle of warmth and light, we gathered around it to share a simple meal of dried meat and hard bread washed down with tea brewed in a smoke-blackened pot that had clearly seen much use in similar camps. "Tell us about the recent disappearances," Holmes said as we finished eating, his face half in shadow and half illuminated by the dancing flames. Blackwood set down his cup and leaned back against a fallen log that served as a natural bench, his expression troubled. "The first occurred 9 days ago. A cook's assistant named Chen, who had gone to the stream to fetch water for the morning meal. He never returned, and when searchers went looking, they found his buckets overturned beside the water and tracks, those enormous tracks leading away into the forest. The second disappearance happened just 5 days past. A young surveyor named Collins, who had been mapping new sections for cutting. He was working alone, against company policy, but common practice nonetheless, and when he failed to return by nightfall, a search party went out with torches and dogs. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness where they winked out like dying stars, and somewhere in the forest an owl called, its voice carrying across the night with a loneliness that seemed to echo the isolation of the missing men. The dogs refused to follow the trail, Thomas added, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the still air. They whined and pulled back, showing fear such as the handlers had never witnessed. Eventually, one of the indigenous workers agreed to track, and he found signs of struggle, broken branches, disturbed earth, and then those same tracks leading into terrain so rough that pursuit was deemed impossible without proper equipment and daylight. He paused, feeding a stick into the fire and watching as it caught and began to burn. But there is something else, something that the logging company does not want known. Items belonging to the missing men have been found, returned almost, placed deliberately in locations where they would be discovered. Holmes leaned forward, his interest visibly sharpening. "Returned? Describe the circumstances precisely." Blackwood reached into his pack and withdrew a cloth bundle, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a pocket watch, a leather wallet, and a small notebook. each item showing signs of exposure to the elements but otherwise undamaged. These belonged to Jacob Hendricks, the first man to disappear months ago. They were found 3 weeks past, arranged on a flat rock beside the main trail into the valley, positioned carefully as if on display. The watch still runs, the wallet contains all its money, and the notebook shows Hendricks's handwriting, entries about work and wages, and letters he intended to write home to Norway. He handed the items to Holmes, who examined them with meticulous care, his long fingers turning them over, holding them to the firelight, studying them from every angle. No blood, no damage beyond what one would expect from environmental exposure, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to us. The implication being that the man was not killed for robbery, and perhaps not killed at all, at least not immediately. He looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight with an almost luminous quality. This suggests capture rather than predation, detention rather than immediate violence. If we accept that the Saskets are responsible, then we must also accept that they are making choices, demonstrating restraint, and possibly attempting some form of communication through the return of these objects. The implications of his words settled over our small group like the darkness beyond our fire's reach, and I felt the mystery deepening, becoming something far more complex than simple questions of whether unknown creatures existed or represented threats to human safety. We maintained watch through the night in 2-hour shifts, Holmes and I alternating with Thomas and Blackwood, though in truth, I doubt any of us slept deeply even during our off-watch periods. The forest at night was alive with sounds both familiar and strange, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the snap of branches in the darkness, the occasional splash from the stream suggesting creatures coming to drink. During my second watch, in the hours before dawn when the darkness seems deepest and the human spirit at its lowest ebb, I heard something that made my blood run cold despite the fire's warmth. It came from the forest perhaps 100 yards distant, a vocalization similar to what we had heard on Blackwood's phonograph, but clearer, more powerful, unfiltered by the limitations of recording technology. The sound rose and fell in complex patterns, and as I sat frozen with one hand on my revolver, I heard an answering call from a different direction, further away, creating a dialogue in a language utterly alien, yet undeniably purposeful. The calls faded into silence, leaving only the crackling of our fire and the rapid beating of my own heart, and I sat in the darkness wondering what messages had been exchanged in those inhuman voices, what intentions had been communicated across the nighttime forest. When Holmes emerged from his bedroll to relieve me at the appointed hour, I related what I had heard, and he nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "They know we are here," he said quietly, settling onto the log I had occupied and feeding fresh wood into the fire. "And they are discussing our presence, deciding perhaps what our arrival means, whether we represent threat or opportunity or something else entirely. Sleep now, Watson. Tomorrow we enter their domain fully, and we will need all our faculties sharp and ready." Dawn came slowly to the forest, the darkness giving way not to sudden light but to gradual gray that filtered through the canopy and revealed the world in stages. First the immediate clearing, then the surrounding trees, and finally the broader landscape beyond. We broke camp efficiently, eating a cold breakfast and packing our gear with the practiced movements of experienced travelers, and as the sun finally broke above the eastern ridges, we resumed our journey toward the valley. The trail climbed now, switchbacking up slopes covered in ancient trees whose roots created natural stairs, and the horses labored steadily upward while we dismounted to walk beside them, sharing their burden and easing their passage over the roughest sections. By mid-morning, we had reached a ridge that overlooked the valley Blackwood had described, and the sight that met our eyes was breathtaking in its wild beauty and its stark illustration of human impact upon pristine wilderness. The valley stretched before us, perhaps 3 miles wide at this point and extending northward until it disappeared into mountains whose peaks still wore snow despite the season. The eastern 2/3 remained covered in old-growth forest, trees so large and densely packed that they created a carpet of green, broken only by the silver threads of streams and the occasional rocky outcrop. But the western third showed the scars of logging, great swaths of bare earth and stumps, raw wounds in the living fabric of the forest where nothing remained but destruction and the skeletal framework of flumes and rail lines used to transport the felled giants to market. The logging camp itself was visible at the valley's southern entrance, a collection of rough buildings and tents clustered around a larger structure that was presumably the company office and store. Smoke rose from cooking fires and the mill's boilers, and even at this distance, we could hear the faint sounds of industrial activity, saws biting into wood, steam whistles marking shift changes, the shouts of men engaged in dangerous labor. But what drew my attention most forcefully was the contrast between the two portions of the valley, the violated and the untouched, civilization and wilderness facing each other across a boundary that seemed to vibrate with tension. The logging operation has penetrated approximately 1/3 of the way into the valley over the past 8 months, Blackwood explained, standing beside us at the overlook. At their current pace, they will reach the valley's northern end within 2 years, destroying everything in their path unless something intervenes to halt the cutting. Holmes stood motionless, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene below, and I could almost see his mind working, cataloging information and constructing theories to explain the pattern of disappearances and the evidence we had gathered. The valley is indeed a natural fortress, as I observed from the maps, he said at length. If the Saskets have made this place their refuge, their last stronghold against human encroachment, then the logging represents an existential threat that would justify extreme defensive measures. He turned to Thomas. The sacred sites your people speak of, where are they located within the valley? Thomas pointed toward the northern reaches, where the valley narrowed and the mountains rose steeply on either side. There, where 3 streams come together and the old growth has never been disturbed even by fire. It is a place of great power, where our ancestors went for vision quests and communication with the spirit world. To cut trees, there would be to sever connections that have existed since the world was young. We descended into the valley as the sun reached its zenith, following a trail that wound through the logged sections where stumps stood like tombstones marking the graves of fallen giants. The destruction was even more shocking at ground level, the scale of it overwhelming, and I found myself thinking of Blackwood's earlier words about the displacement of the native megafauna and wondering if humanity's capacity for transformation would ultimately consume everything wild and mysterious until nothing remained but managed landscapes and tamed nature. The logging camp bustled with activity as we approached, men moving between buildings with the purposeful haste of workers paid by production rather than hours, and the air was thick with sawdust and the sharp scent of freshly cut cedar. We were met by the camp supervisor, a hard-faced man named Garrison, who greeted Blackwood with barely concealed hostility and regarded Holmes, Thomas, and myself with open suspicion. "I told you before, Professor, that we don't need outsiders stirring up trouble with superstitious nonsense," he said bluntly, his voice carrying the flat vowels of the American Midwest. "We have a business to run here, investors to satisfy, and these disappearances are already causing enough disruption without adding hysteria about monsters in the woods." Holmes stepped forward, his manner calm but authoritative. "Mr. Garrison, I am Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, and I have been engaged to investigate the disappearances as a matter of criminal inquiry. Whether the explanation proves to be natural, supernatural, or purely human in origin, the truth will be uncovered, and it will serve everyone's interests to cooperate fully with this investigation." Something in Holmes's tone, or perhaps his reputation, which had evidently reached even these remote territories, caused Garrison's hostility to moderate slightly, though suspicion remained in his narrowed eyes. "Fine. Investigate all you want, but don't interfere with operations or spread panic among the workers. We're already short-handed enough without men refusing to work because of ghost stories." He gestured toward a small building at the edge of the camp. "You can use the old survey office there as your base. I'll have someone bring you the files on the missing men, for all the good it will do you." With that dismissive statement, he turned and strode away, barking orders at nearby workers who scattered to their tasks with the alacrity of men accustomed to harsh supervision. The survey office proved to be a single room furnished with a rough table, several chairs, a pot-bellied stove, and walls covered with maps showing the valley in various stages of exploitation. Holmes immediately appropriated the table for his materials, spreading out his notes and the items Blackwood had collected, while Thomas built a fire in the stove to drive out the chill that had accumulated during the building's disuse. I examined the maps with growing understanding of the systematic approach the logging company had taken, dividing the valley into sections and working through them in sequence, each area stripped bare before moving to the next. The most recent sections pushed ever closer to the northern reaches where the sacred sites lay, and I could see clearly how the Saskets, if they existed and if they valued these places as the indigenous account suggested, would perceive the logging as an advancing threat that would ultimately destroy everything they held essential. We spent the remainder of the day interviewing workers who had witnessed aspects of the disappearances or who had encountered the strange signs and sounds that had become increasingly common as the logging progressed deeper into the valley. Most were reluctant to speak openly, fear of ridicule or dismissal clearly weighing heavily, but Holmes's patient questioning and evident respect for their experiences gradually loosened tongues. We heard accounts of massive footprints found near work sites, of trees twisted and broken in patterns that suggested tremendous strength applied with deliberate intent, of food stores raided with uncanny precision that left only certain items taken while others of equal value remained untouched. One old timber faller, a Swede named Larson who had worked forests across 3 continents, spoke of seeing a figure watching from the tree line at dawn, too tall and too broad to be human, standing motionless for several minutes before fading back into the forest with no more sound than morning mist dissolving. As evening approached and workers returned to camp for the supper meal, Holmes called our small group together in the survey office and laid out his preliminary conclusions. We are dealing with intelligent beings who understand cause and effect, who recognize the threat the logging poses, and who have progressed from passive observation to active intervention. The pattern of disappearances suggests capture and detention rather than killing, which implies either restraint born of moral consideration or strategic thinking that recognizes the consequences of human deaths. The return of personal effects reinforces this interpretation, suggesting an attempt at communication, perhaps a warning or a demonstration that they possess power over life and death, but choose not to exercise it fully. He paused, his fingers drumming against the table. The question now becomes how to establish actual communication, how to bridge the gap between human and Saskets in a way that might resolve this conflict before it escalates beyond the point of peaceful resolution. Thomas had been silent during much of the day's activities, but now he spoke with quiet authority. There may be a way, though it requires us to venture into the forest at night and place ourselves at their mercy, demonstrating trust and peaceful intent through action rather than words they cannot understand. He met each of our gazes in turn. The elders of my people have agreed to perform a ceremony at the confluence of the 3 streams in the sacred place, calling upon the ancient agreements between peoples and asking for a meeting, a parley in the old way, but it must be done properly, with respect and humility, and those who go must be willing to face whatever comes without weapons or aggression. The weight of what he proposed settled over us, and I saw Holmes's expression shift through calculation to decision. When? He asked simply. Thomas glanced toward the window where darkness was gathering. Tomorrow night, when the moon is full and the forest can see us clearly as we can see it. We will go unarmed, bearing gifts as our ancestors did, and we will wait to see if the Saskets choose to reveal themselves. That night, lying in my bunk in the bunkhouse that Garrison had grudgingly provided, I stared at the ceiling and contemplated what we had committed ourselves to, the extraordinary leap of faith required to walk unarmed into wilderness inhabited by creatures powerful enough to make men vanish without trace. Yet I felt no desire to withdraw, for the mystery had become something more than mere investigation. It had become a test of whether understanding could bridge the vast gulf between different forms of consciousness, whether peace was possible between civilizations whose very natures seemed fundamentally incompatible. Sleep came eventually, troubled by dreams of forests that watched with ancient eyes and voices calling across darkness in languages older than human memory. If you enjoyed this journey into mystery and wonder, please subscribe to see more stories that explore the boundaries between the known and the unknown. Like this video if you found yourself drifting peacefully towards sleep, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what mysteries still hide in the world's wild places. Until we meet again in another tale, may your dreams be peaceful, may your rest be deep, and may you always keep a corner of your heart open to wonder. Good night, dear friend, and sleep well.